I'm very pleased to welcome Mike Bonkowski back to the Historical Society tonight. It's been 1 year since you were here last? Exactly, yeah. Mike initially delivered a well-received, tie-by-tie, trestle after trestle presentation of the ENN Railroad and its subdivisions. Tonight, Mike will continue with the theme of our transportation legacies with his study of the historic passenger ships and ferries that served Nanaimo from 1881 to 1961. The second chapter in this three-part series begins with the launching of the BC Ferries service in 1961 and to the present time. So we'll look forward to that whenever it's ready, Mike.
Yep.
Further up the road ahead, we may hear from Mike regarding his investigation into the island-based histories and services of the locomotive collection at the BC Discovery Center. BC Forest Museum, BC Forest Discovery Center. Okay, that's the new name. At Duncan. Like the ships remembered tonight, these machines are touchstones to logging camps and settlements that were erased from the landscape and faded into the shades of our past. Mike is a lifelong Vancouver Islander whose interest in its built environment and transportation history was piqued through family field trips and his father's running commentary about this, that, and why along the way. Now, a former accountant by profession, Mike's passion is to take the world along on his own field trips and outings, on the tracks and over the water, via his YouTube channel, Low Light Mike.
Yeah.
With that, I give you Mike.
Thanks, Daryl. Thank you.
Who gets the mic?
First of all, we'll make sure, how far do I walk in? I don't walk in that far. Okay. So yes, BC Ferries road trips. And I'm a child born in the late 1960s at what we called the New Hospital here in Nanaimo. And in the 1970s, we would do family road trips, generally out of Departure Bay to the mainland via BC Ferries in that 70s era. Occasionally, we would take Canadian Pacific's Princess of Vancouver, but that was only when BC Ferries happened to not be sailing because of a labor dispute. That happened a few times in the 1970s, and as we're going to see, that's kind of ironic that we would take Canadian Pacific because BC Ferries was not sailing. So this talk, from a Nanaimo perspective, there's a photo. This is a good time to say this is from the Stephen Pickens collection. Stephen J. Pickens is an author and historian from Anacortes, Washington, and he loves the Canadian Pacific Princess Fleet images, so he has an extensive collection. He's also written a couple books, Ferries of Puget Sound, and a book called Crossing Puget Sound. The title here is significant, From Blackball Steamer to Washington State Ferries. And the similar thing happened in British Columbia about 10 years after it happened in Washington State. But this talk is done from a Nanaimo perspective because how people traveled to and from the nearby big cities and other settlements is based on what you had in your city. So if this were a talk in Victoria, this would be a lot different. We would be talking about the Victoria Inner Harbor. If we were talking in Courtenay Comox, we would be focusing on something else. But this is Nanaimo, Cameron Island. So the title is Remembering Passenger Ships That Served Nanaimo from 1881 to 1961. The more solid bookend to that date range, which is odd, I admit, it's 80 years, 1961, a nice firm ending that we will get to at the end of this talk. In 1881, well, I've got a bit of justification for starting in 1881, but it was really hard to figure out when did people start traveling by ship to and from Nanaimo. So I just stuck with 1881, although obviously there was lots of travel before then. But I'm going to read you the synopsis of the talk, because this is where I tried to really get it concise, and then we'll get into more of the detail. I go, from paddle wheelers on a route between Nanaimo and Victoria in the early 1880s, up until the black Ball Ferries Kahloke and Chinook, about to be bought out by BC Ferries in 1961, this 80-year period takes us from antiquated early passenger ships Through the rise, the golden age and decline of the elegant Canadian Pacific steamships, yeah, they really were quite elegant, to the new era of fast, utilitarian, drive-on, drive-off automobile ferries. This is an interesting transportation period with various early companies morphing into what became Canadian Pacific. Also, the Ball Ferries story is compelling in how they set up shop in BC for only a brief 10-year period, but yet forever changed the game for ferry service in coastal BC. So that's what we're talking about. My criteria, it took a long time to get it focused on something that would fit into 30, 35 minutes or so, but it's regularly scheduled passenger and later passenger and vehicle ships in and out of Nanaimo. My primary research is the great books of Robert Turner, and particularly his Pacific Princesses book, and his ENN railway books, the steam years and the via shortline years. So let's start. Second slide. This is the first one slide and only slide that's just verbiage, but it takes us through the various companies leading up to Canadian Pacific, which, surprise, is probably the big player that we talk about this evening, Canadian Pacific. But how did we get there? Well, I needed to find a starting point, like I said. So I started in 1881 because that's when a fellow named Captain Irving sold a side-wheeler ship, and this ship was called the Wilson G. Hunt. He sold it to a guy in Victoria named Joseph Spratt, and he placed her on a route between Victoria and Nanaimo, and his company was called the East Coast Mail Line. Now, I don't know if it was really just mail and cargo or if passengers too, but I'm taking some license and saying, okay, that's 1881. It's a nice starting point to my 1961 ending. I will start there. And then the second ship we have, there was a side-wheeler launched in New Westminster in late 1882, and they named it the Robert Dunsmuir. Now, this was 6.5 years before Mr. Dunsmuir died. So they named it for him while he was still alive, which I guess is how they did things. And then a few months later, in early 1883, it started a service, passenger service, between New Westminster and Nanaimo. Now, it's not Vancouver. I always have to remember with history, we look at it not through our today lens where Vancouver is the big city. This is 1883. This is 3 years before Vancouver started to exist as a incorporated city. So New Westminster was the important lower mainland city because, of course, it had been the capital of the Crown Colony of BC back when we had 2 separate Crown colonies. Side note, later years, the Robert Dunsmuir ship was known as Dirty Bob. And that's because it carried a lot of coal. They used it to transport coal, but it's also, yeah, it's kind of funny. Then we have the Canadian Pacific Navigation Company, which of course we have to immediately say is not related to Canadian Pacific Railway. They just happen to use 2 of the same words in their company name. And this started in 1883. That John Irving guy, he merged his Pioneer Line ships in with the Hudson's Bay Company steamers and created Canadian Pacific Navigation. And they operated various routes on the coast, and including a route between Nanaimo and Victoria. Yes, Victoria, not the lower mainland. And I was like, well, why wouldn't they take the railway? Because this is 1884, and the ENN Railway was not built till later on in 1886. So we needed a ship. And one of the ships that was used was a stern wheeler called the R.P. Rithett. Then the ENN Railway from Esquimalt to Nanaimo at that time was completed in 1886. And traffic then on that stern wheeler route decreased because it was just much easier to take the train. And the footnote on this is that Canadian Pacific Navigation did end up getting bought out by Canadian Pacific Railway, making the universe mesh nicely with that name, in 1901, and that will impact what we talk about later. But then we got the ENN Railway, and they had their own steamships. So the Esquimalt and Nanaimo portion completed in August 1886. And then we had passenger ships that started. And so around 1890, they started a passenger route between Nanaimo Harbor and Vancouver Harbor. Aha, this is our first downtown Nanaimo to downtown Vancouver service that I've noted, E&N Railway steamships started that around 1890. Originally, it was one sailing each way, each day, and they timed the Vancouver departure to be after the transcontinental train arrived in Vancouver. So, you could arrive in Vancouver by train, get off the train, you're in Burrard Inlet area, and hop on over to the E&N steamship and go to Vancouver Island, if it all worked well. The main ship on that route was the Joan, named for Joan Dunsmuir. And other ships sometimes used on that Vancouver-Nanaimo route were the Robert Dunsmuir, and also there's a ship called the City of Nanaimo. And if you Google old City of Nanaimo ships, you will see various photos in the archives of those 3 ships. They also did other routes, the E&N did, up and down the coast of Vancouver Island, because this was in the era before the E&N Railway was extended up to Courtenay. So Nanaimo needed to connect via ship efficiently to Comox Valley, Union Bay, places like that. Then, in 1905, the E&N steamship fleet, along with the entire E&N Railway, was sold by James Dunsmuir to guess who? The Canadian Pacific Railway. And so this E&N steamship route from Nanaimo Harbor to Vancouver Harbor was essentially the prequel to the same route operated by Canadian Pacific up until the early 1980s. A typical schedule for the steamer Joan was that she would take 3¼ hours, daily service every day except Sunday, leaving Nanaimo at 7 a.m., and then leaving Vancouver again at 1:30 p.m. after the train had arrived. And then the last preliminary company is Union Steamships of British Columbia, which is a very familiar name on the coast. They had a successful, long business history operating routes out of downtown Vancouver to various coastal settlements, coastal work sites. However, not so successful with a Nanaimo service. They gave it a go for Nanaimo, Vancouver between 1890 and 1892 using a ship called the Cutch, C-U-T-C-H. And the terminal was a place called Johnston's Wharf, which was roughly, I think, below where the Bastion is. I like to use words like roughly and approximately when I'm not sure. Gives you a rough idea. But they had an unsuccessful attempt, mainly because the history books told me, because the E&N Railway steamships just happened to have better, more faster, more efficient service at that time. And so Union steamships never really stuck with the Nanaimo route. And the closest connection I think we have is the fact that one of the last Union steamships was the very tiny Lady Rose. And after she had finished working for Union steamships, she was sold and then happened to have a long career working the Alberni Inlet and places like that. And that's our tie to that. But then we get to Canadian Pacific Railways, BC Coast Steamship Service. That's a mouthful for me. So it started in 1901, when they purchased Canadian Pacific Navigation Company. And then in March 1901, they hired Captain James Troop to be their manager. And he came from the Kootenays, where he had worked on lake and river steamships in the BC Kootenays. So this set up Canadian Pacific's coast service to really start a period of growth and offering what we now look back on as that classic Canadian Pacific steamship service. And then, of course, significant to Nanaimo is that by 1905, in 1905, the E&N Railway was purchased by Canadian Pacific. So that route to Vancouver became a Canadian Pacific route, still using the ship Joan. Joan, however, was not all that great in rough weather, and they continued to use her just for a few more years until 1911, when she was replaced by the Princess Patricia. We'll talk about her in a sec. It's a good time to mention that Canadian Pacific named its steamship services with the Princess prefix, and they did that probably to complement the fact that their ocean-going large ships used the Empress prefix. So Empress, Princess, and then those of us know that in the 1970s, BC Ferries decided to one-up them and start with Queens. But we're still in the Princess era here. So we're going to talk about 4 main CP Princess passenger ships that were used on the Vancouver to Nanaimo route over the years, and they offer a wide variety of styles and eras during the time. Of course, there were other ships used that I'm not going to talk about because they were just temporary or not as prominent or long-serving out of Nanaimo. And then there was also that thing at Newcastle Island, which is where Canadian Pacific would take ships from Vancouver for company picnics. So they would all pile on board a Vancouver company. All the employees would pile on board in Vancouver, sail to Newcastle, Seisuchen. I did not say that right, but I'm close. And they would have a company picnic there and then sail back at the end of the day. And also they would even moor ships at Newcastle Island to use as floating hotels. But apart from mentioning that now, that's as much as we're going to get on that. We're focusing on the main ships. Here's our first one. There's a postcard view. This is the Princess Patricia. This is the first Princess Patricia. Canadian Pacific had 2 of them. The second one, which essentially was the first Princess cruise ship, looked quite different. This is a different era. This is the early 20th century. They built this in 1903 for someone else, but then Canadian Pacific purchased her in 1912. Very simple ship, not much in terms of upper deck cabin area, but this is a 1903 era ship. However, she was innovative. She was steam turbine powered, and this was the first such power in the CP fleet. And apparently, for a passenger ship anywhere in the world, this was the second steam turbine powered ship. She had a top speed, which is when you're really going all out, 21.6 knots. She carried 960 passengers, 9 automobiles. Just start to mention, that's going to be a trend. Okay, 9 automobiles on this ship. Does not look like a car ferry. I'm thinking that automobiles were just a type of cargo that was probably stowed in a cumbersome way. But this is the first time we're mentioning cars. Primarily a passenger ship. There's a bunch of people, and if this were the social media era, they would all be taking selfies as they're on board, ready to come into port. But thankfully, it's not. Robert Turner described the Patricia as providing a fast daytime service, and that's what she did. She was not an overnight ship. So it was a 2-hour crossing of the Strait of Georgia, and she worked this route from 1912 to 1928. Historical footnote, and David will know this, her bell is in the Nanaimo Museum as a displayed artifact. That takes us to our next ship, the lovely Princess Elaine. Here's a view of her in Vancouver Harbor. She was built in 1928 to replace the Princess Patricia on this Vancouver Nanaimo route. Lovely ship. I'm going to say that a lot. To me, all ships are lovely, but to paraphrase George Orwell, some are more lovely than others. Here she is coming in, guess what, under the Lions Gate Bridge in Vancouver. She was a triple screw turbine steamship. 6 staterooms, but not a night boat. So staterooms for those people that wanted to get away from the crowd. But a 60 vehicle car deck on there. So we're up from 9 on the Patricia to 60 vehicles on the Elaine. She had a long career. We'll talk about that in a second. Here's another view. Okay, now we're into Nanaimo. I love historical photos because you can see there's Protection Island midpoint in there with Gallows Point and Gabriola in the background. She's reversing out of the Cameron Island terminal. Her crossing to Vancouver, 2 hours, 15 minutes. A little bit slower than the Patricia, but still a whole lot faster than what was coming up soon. Let's take a closer look. That is a lovely photo. Rear 3/4 view of the Elaine leaving. You can see the cargo doors are open on the side, which is how the vehicles got in and out in that CP cumbersome way. She worked until 1951 as the main ship on this route, thereafter as an extra ship, primarily in the summer, off and on till 1962. My connection to the Elaine is my father took it in 1949. Well, lots of people took it, but that was the final leg of his immigration to Canada journey when he took it from Vancouver, after having got off the train, to Nanaimo. So let's take a brief moment and talk about terminals for Canadian Pacific in Nanaimo. The original terminal, as far as I know, was below the post office building, so kind of below the present-day Lighthouse Bistro, below Harbor Air Office, somewhere around there. Then between 1946 and 1945, Canadian Pacific really changed the waterfront look in Nanaimo because they purchased new sites and developed them. And some of those sites, well, Cameron Island for starters, and then south of Cameron Island along the waterfront, and that was an area that previously was used for coal work. It was coal processing, coal washing and shipment by Canadian Collieries Dunsmuir Limited. And so Canadian Pacific bought those areas over a number of years and started to develop them. They were going to use them for three different things. Number one, a steamship ferry terminal. Number two, a railway yard. And number three, a barge ferry transfer slip for rail cars. So first thing is the steamship terminal at Cameron Island. We'll look at a photo of that later. Spoiler alert, it's the same as the cover photo we started with. But they opened that in May 1949, the steamship terminal at Cameron Island. And eventually it also included the bus depot for Vancouver Island coach lines. And this is the first time I'm comfortable in this talk to say that there are probably some of us in this room who remember either taking a steamship from Cameron Island or at least doing something with the bus depot at Cameron Island. Second item is the Wilcox Railway Yard, and I'll show you a photo of that. It's my photo, finally one of mine. The railway yard was built further south of Cameron Island. It's still there below West Linnaeus Street. In this photo, I'm standing on the Port Drive Trestle Bridge and looking towards the waterfront, and those black towers on the right, which are still there, that's for the barge transfer slip that they built in that same era. So this redevelopment at what became known as Wilcox Railway Yard, which is a derivation of the words Wellington and colliery. That was something I learned in my research. They opened that in 1955, and that date was key because it was a couple years after the last coal activity ended at this area of processing coal, after the Bright Mine closed in 1953. So we have Wilcox Railway Yard, still there, still being used today, and that transfer slip, still there, still being used every week at least for railway cars to come to and from Vancouver Island. They opened it in 1955. That barge slip was able to work at almost any level of tide, which was a big deal, especially when they were receiving rail cars any time of the day because it takes a while to tug and barge from the mainland. It replaced the old transfer slips for the railway, by the way, that were at Ladysmith at a place called Transfer Beach. Get it? Transfer slips, Transfer Beach. And the backup place was at Nanaimo Bay in a place they called Jayham. So the Wilcox transfer slip is still there, but we're going to get back to ships. And here we go. There's Cameron Island Ferry Dock with the lovely ship called the Princess of Nanaimo. And this is the third of our CP ships that we're talking about, the third of four. So the ship was built in 1951 at Fairfield Shipbuilding on the Clyde River in Scotland. Canadian Pacific had most of their ships built in Scotland. She was a steam turbine engine ferry. And this photo is 1958. So that's interesting to me for a couple of reasons. A, it's nice color. The boat basin looks just lovely, but notice the signage. CP, if your eyes are bionic here, you can see they market it very much as a ferry terminal, not a steamship terminal. This is 1958. CP is very much in the thick of competition with black Ball Ferries. So they are very much calling themselves a ferry to downtown Vancouver. This is when we start to have things that are concurrent with Blackball, which we will talk about next in this talk in a little bit. But Princess of Nanaimo, 1951 she was built. She only served on the Nanaimo route until 1962. That's 11 years. That is not very long. And she was only the main ship on the route until 1955. Then afterwards, it was the Princess of Vancouver. Now, she was a day ship, so she was not with overnight cabins. 1,500 passengers, that's a lot. 100 automobiles, but loading from a side door onto 2 different decks. So now if we're charting the progression of automobile ferries for Canadian Pacific, 19 on the Patricia, 19 car capacity, 60 cars on the Elaine, and now we're up to 100 automobiles on this. Let's take a look at her. Oh, lovely interior. This is how CP marketed her with this brochure. We have the lovely forward observation room with those plush seats, but then also, if you wanted a stateroom, the comfortable daytime quarters where you could write a postcard, smoke a cigarette, and sit and look at what looks to be a fireplace or something similar. It gets better. Spend time in the friendly dining room with the white tablecloths and the waiter in a white jacket and bow tie, or sit in the spacious lounge where you can again smoke a cigarette, talk with your friends, and talk about what you're going to do when you go to Vancouver or coming back to Nanaimo. Notice that there's no photographs in this promotional material of the car deck. This was very much marketed as a, in the tradition of Canadian Pacific steamships, an elegant, comfortable service.
Mike, one
Yeah.
on the left,
Yeah.
photograph on the wall behind is Canadian Pacific. That's Lake Louise, Alberta.
Oh my, yeah. Back when the glacier was a bit more full, and yeah. Thanks, Tom. Yeah. Just a little bit of a Canadian Pacific marketing tie-in. Here she is coming into Cameron Island. I spent a little bit of time sorting out whether this was Cole Harbour or Cameron Island, and then I very quickly realized, no, everything lines up to be Cameron Island with the mainland mountains in the far background and Newcastle in protection. So let's talk about her as a vehicle ferry, because that's what they eventually tried to call her. So she definitely had more vehicle capacity than the Princess Elaine previously, and she was apparently faster loading for vehicles, but she quickly proved to be inadequate for what was becoming a automobile-dominated travel market between Vancouver and Vancouver Island. So this is where I interject some looking back in hindsight editorial commentary and say, okay, CP built this in 1951, the Princess of Nanaimo. They really should have built a ship of a new design, having like a modern automobile ferry design with a look to the future. And this was more of a look to the past. I mean, she is a lovely ship, but she looks like more like a classic small steamship that just happens to be able to carry some cars. And of course, I'm generalizing, but I think history looks back at this as a wrong ship decision when CP had this built in 1951. And we'll talk more about why that is when we compare it to Blackball. 1962, she was done on the west coast, and they moved her to the east coast of Canada. They renamed her Princess of Acadia, and she worked a route from St. John, New Brunswick to Digby, Nova Scotia. Not a long career on the west coast for a ship named Princess of Nanaimo. But however, a longer career for this one. Are you ready? There we have the very lovely Princess of Vancouver, this postcard coming under Lionsgate Bridge. Sometime before 1968, because her funnel is still CP buff beige color and black. And we also don't have any car deck loading doors on the side. So this is about before 1963. I loved being able to date a photo based on particulars like that. So she was built in Scotland in 1955. And she is an interesting contrast to the Princess of Nanaimo. Built, just 4 years before. So CP is building a different ship for a multitude of purposes, and we'll talk about that. She was delivered to Nanaimo in 55, apparently carrying a load of English cars that were destined for sale in the Canadian market. Started work on Vancouver-Nanaimo route in 55. She was a heavier ship, I'm assuming, built to handle rail cars. Her Nanaimo berth was at Wilcox Rail Yard, those black towers that are still there. Service speed, 15.5 knots, so we're getting a bit slower compared to the faster earlier ships. Diesel engines, 2 hours, 45 minutes sailing time to Vancouver, so just shy of 3 hours downtown to downtown. That is what I remember as a kid. Let's take a look at her arriving in Cole Harbour, Vancouver. She did 3 round trips a day on the Vancouver and Nanaimo route. As of October 62, she was the only ship left on that Canadian Pacific route, still doing 3 round trips a day. But before 1962, there were more ships operating in tandem with her on that route. I've seen an October 61 schedule. Old schedules are really interesting for this. And they had 3 ships on the Nanaimo route. They had the Princess of Vancouver, supplemented by Princess of Nanaimo and the second Princess Marguerite, doing a combined 8 sailings in each direction every day, leaving Vancouver as early as 5 a.m., then throughout the day spaced and as late as midnight, leaving Vancouver, leaving Nanaimo as early as 1 a.m., as you do, and then spaced out throughout the morning, and the last one at 9 p.m. So that was the schedule in 1961. I think of her as a Swiss Army knife type of ship. 3 different purposes that I can see simultaneously: passengers, rail cars, and automobiles and trucks. And her original configuration, the rail cars and the automobiles and trucks were all together on the same main deck, which you accessed by a stern loading door only. That's how you got in, that's how you got out. That was the original configuration. 800 passengers was the capacity, and if you just put automobiles on that main deck, you could get 120 autos in there. If you just put rail cars on the main deck, you'd get 28 rail cars on 4 tracks. The rails were embedded in the deck, or you could get a bunch of large truck trailers or a combination thereof. And apparently the decor in the passenger lounge when it was built was your typical modern mid-50s design and decor. Here she is leaving Vancouver in another postcard view. And this is after 1968 because her funnel is changed to red. And they have the new Canadian Pacific multi-mark Pac-Man style logo on the funnel. 1963, she had a refit that changed a few things. They added a new car area, not an entirely new deck, but on the passenger deck, in the middle of the passenger deck, they set up a car area that held 55 cars. And it's going to be side loading. And the way it worked on the Nanaimo, you loaded in from one side, you pretty much drove around a circle, and you departed the other side in Vancouver. And what I remember as a kid, if you were walking from the dining room area to the forward lounge, you walked through the car deck. There was no other way to get to the forward lounge. And it was very much the twisty drive around to get on and off. She worked the Nanaimo route until 1981. And at that time, CP sold her to the BC Department of Highways for use on the saltwater fleet of Department of Highways on the Powell River Comox route. Side note, and we'll catch up to this in a second, in 1981 when they did that, on the Powell River route, she replaced another ship that was called the Seashell Queen, which used to be the Chinook, which used to be a black Ball ferry. But we're going to talk about that in a sec. It's a lot of trying to line up all the things. This is where history is overlapping for my talk. After working that Powell River route, she eventually did a stint on the BC Steamship Company, which had a summer route from Victoria to Seattle, most famously served by the second Princess Marguerite. But when the Princess of Vancouver worked this, they renamed her Vancouver Island Princess. And where did she end up? She ended up in China, working as a ferry. And that's where her story ended. So that's it for the CP era in Nanaimo. 1981, they stuck it out. Let's talk about Blackball. Different game, different set of ships, different style. There's a promotional thing from sometime around 1955 because both ships are listed. We'll talk about them. Who was Blackball? Well, it's an operating name. You sometimes see Blackball Line or Blackball Ferries. It was the Puget Sound Navigation Company in Puget Sound of the state of Washington. And the character was Captain Alex Peabody. And Captain Peabody had those routes in Puget Sound, and he operated them car ferries. He had a collection of old car ferries. This is like leading up to the 1950s. Then in 1951, the state of Washington, the government, wanted to get into the ferry service and wanted to take over. So this is where I use a bit of artistic license and say I think it was somewhat forcibly purchased by the state of Washington from Puget Sound, or at least Captain Peabody felt like he had no other choice but to be bought out, and I don't think he was happy with that. He wasn't ready to retire in 1951, and they were buying out his routes. So that became Washington State Ferries, which is still an entity today. Spoiler alert, another one, 10 years later in 1961, the same kind of thing happened in British Columbia to Black Ball, where they got bought out by a government ferry service, but this time it would be more amiable. But, and here's the big however, although the state of Washington bought most of Captain Peabody's Black Ball ships in Puget Sound and the routes, there were a few ships that they didn't buy. So he had a small fleet of leftover ships and needed to decide what to do with them. Well, guess what? He looked north and he saw that coastal BC had the potential for needing new, fast, and when I use fast ferries, we're not talking in the context of the 1990s here. We're talking about a faster ship than the old dawdling CP steamships. He saw that there was potential for fast drive-on, drive-off ferry service, and he saw that Black Ball could get into that game almost immediately by starting a route between Greater Vancouver and the Lower Sunshine Coast. So in 1951, Captain Peabody brought some of his leftover ships from Puget Sound to coastal BC, and he started Black Ball Ferries. A fast, here's what Robert Turner called them, and this is, I like this quote, a fast, automobile-orientated service. Nice and simple, but what a difference from the Canadian Pacific game of elegant passenger experience. Black Ball would eventually have 3 routes in BC that they created. Horseshoe Bay was the terminal, west of West Vancouver, way out there. They immediately started in 1951 with a route to Gibson's on the Lower Sunshine Coast. Yes, Gibson's itself. And then 6 years later, they moved that to Langdale, where it still is. 1953, they started a route to Nanaimo. We'll talk about that in a sec. And then in 1954, one more, Jervis Inlet, Earls Cove to Saltry Bay, allowing them to connect to the Upper Sunshine Coast and Powell River. But Departure Bay, Horseshoe Bay is what we are here to talk about. Eventually, they had 2 ships on the route, and both of them made 5 return trips each day. That's a long day. In contrast, BC Ferries today on the Departure Bay route, a ship makes 4 return trips every day. So Black Ball was working a really long day, starting early, going late with tight turnaround points. So they started with one ship, the Kahloke, in 1953. She home ported in Nanaimo at the start, in the era when they had one ship on the route. And here's another interesting quote in one of their advertising brochures when they were introducing the service, and this very much speaks to the contrast of Canadian Pacific and how they tried to differentiate themselves. So they said about Black Ball, they said, overhead vehicle clearance of 15 feet, 6 inches, plenty of room for house trailers and trucks. And here's the kicker. You drive straight onto the big Kahloke, no turning. That was in their brochure advertisement for this new service. You drive straight on, straight off, no turning. That's a big difference from Canadian Pacific, and that was the game changer. By 1955, they had 2 ships on the Nanaimo route, so that's 10 departures each way every day, every 2 hours. First one at 6 a.m., last one at midnight. Yes, that's a really long service day with tight turnaround, which was easier when you had smaller ships. You can't do that with larger ships. There's just not enough time. But that's how it worked in 1955. Let's talk about some ships. Here's the lovely Kahloke, which in the Chinook language means white swan. You'll note that BC Ferries, if you go up to Hornby Island sometime and some other places, currently has a ship that looks nothing like this, also named Kahloke, continuing that legacy. But this is our Kahloke from that era. Steam engine ferry originally, she had a weird history. She had 2 lives. Her first life, she was built in 1903 for the east coast of the United States, and her name was Asbury Park, named for a place in New Jersey, I believe. And then eventually they moved her to the other coast of the US and they named her the city of Sacramento, and she worked in California. Well, Puget Sound Navigation, Black Ball's company, brought her to BC in 1952, and they did an extreme makeover ship edition of her. Basically, from the waterline up, they demolished and rebuilt her. So they did the demolition at Capital Iron in Victoria, as they did. That's where a lot of the old CP ships were also scrapped, demolished. And then they did the rebuild at Yarrows in Victoria, and she emerged as the Kahloke with diesel engines, 100 vehicle capacity, 1,000 passengers, 19 knot service speed, a modern, at that time, car ferry. Let's take a look at a lovely photo of her arriving at Horseshoe Bay with those Howe Sound Mountains. And we have a better photo of her coming up in a sec, but she started that Departure Bay, Horseshoe Bay route June 1953, just in time for summer that year. There's a lovely photo of her at Horseshoe Bay. Look at the colors of the red and black funnel and the white ship with the Howe Sound Mountains. A bit has changed at Horseshoe Bay, but it's still a beautiful scene. After Black Ball, she worked various routes for BC Ferries, eventually was renamed Langdale Queen. Gives you an idea of perhaps where she worked in the late 70s, and she was retired from BC Ferries in 1977. Hung around the Lower Mainland in various places, and there's articles on her in Western Mariner magazine of eventually finding her sunken hull, I believe. I want to say that was in Howe Sound, but I'm not sure. Then we got the lovely Chinook. Here's a brochure photo from her when she was built in 1947. Puget Sound Navigation had her built in 47 for its Seattle, Port Angeles, Victoria route. She was built to hold 100 vehicles and 1,000 passengers, so just like Kahloke, diesel engines, a modern ferry built in 1947, very forward-thinking at the time by Puget Sound Navigation. Here's the contrast with CP. This is 1947 for Chinook, nice and modern. 4 years later, in 51, is when Canadian Pacific built the Princess of Nanaimo, which was not a forward-looking ship of the times. So 4 years before that, in 47, Captain Peabody got it right for Puget Sound Navigation, Black Ball. So by the early 1950s, the Chinook was working the route from Port Angeles to Victoria. Hey, that route still exists today. But there was decreasing traffic on that route at the time, and so he decided to do something different with the ship. He had a hot market Departure Bay, Horseshoe Bay with one ship. It could handle 2 ships. So he brought the Chinook to BC in 1955 to work that Departure Bay route alongside the Kahloke. Here's Departure Bay. I like photos that obviously are like you can connect with these days and go, yeah, that's a ship coming to Departure Bay Ferry Terminal with Newcastle Island. That lovely billboard marketing themselves every 2 hours on the even hour, 6 a.m. to midnight, even with daylight saving time. Yeah, Black Ball Lines, how they marketed themselves. I love these kind of ferry terminal photos because some of us in this room have taken ferry terminal photos as well, and they just endure for the era. So they brought her to BC in 1955. They had to do a couple things when they brought her to BC. Number one is there was already a ship somewhere else in Canada named the Chinook. So technically they had to rename her the Chinook II, but they pretty much just referred to her as the Chinook. Also, they had to chop off her bow. This is how she used to look. Nice, lovely, well, that's an artist rendition, but nice traditional ship bow. And then chopped off. We'll see more photos in a second. In order to do car loading through the bow door, because that's what Black Ball was all about. Side note, when she left the Victoria-Port Angeles route in 1955, she was replaced by a Washington State ferry of the time called the Kahloke, which was nicknamed the Silver Slug and looked exactly like a silver slug. I had a conversation with my wife about this, and she goes, "Oh, pictures of the interior, that's kind of like Art Deco." And I'm like, it is Art Deco. It was that beautiful time capsule of that. But the Kahloke worked the Port Angeles route for a few years in the summer, and then eventually A similarly named company, but not quite related, called Blackball Transport, which we will call kind of a distant cousin, started operating the Port Angeles Victoria route with a modern late 1950s ship called the Coho. And if you ever want to step back into 1958, take the Coho. You will step back in time and experience that to this day between Victoria and Port Angeles. But that's a different Blackball company, but it's still operating, so it's interesting. There we go. Here's the Chinook arriving at Horseshoe Bay. If this shot was taken from the railway, then this is after 1956 when BC Rail, PGE Railway was extended, or maybe it's from the road to Squamish. I just know that my buddy Jim has probably been there and taken similar photos from that same place in Horseshoe Bay. What a lovely view.
Incidentally, Mike, that's about exactly where the Horseshoe Bay Tunnel
Ah.
was constructed in the early 70s.
Okay, the railway tunnel right there. Okay, yeah. And there she is in Horseshoe Bay at the berth. This is 1957. Lovely ship. Again, all ships are lovely to me. After Blackball, what happened? She worked various routes for BC Ferries. They renamed her, of course, the Seashell Queen, because she probably worked the route to Langdale for a while. But then guess what? She was sold to BC Department of Highways Fleet in 1976, and they placed her on that favorite route, Comox to Powell River. And she worked it until 1982, when she was replaced by the Princess of Vancouver that we've already talked about. All old ships go to the Powell River Comox route. Hey, eventually the original BC Ferry Queen of Sydney would end up there as well. That's what I took in the mid-1990s a lot. But this ship, the Chinook, mid-1980s, she was sold and eventually sold to various places in the US, and people had different ideas of what to try to do with her. Someone had an idea of running her on a Great Lakes route in Lake Michigan. Someone else, a floating casino. None of that happened, and eventually she was scrapped. Mr. Stephen Pickens, who provided this image, has a fondness for the Chinook and has done a lot of work tracking what eventually happened to her. Some of it was hard to figure out. But now we're going to talk about 1958. We're almost done, so thanks for hanging in there. 1958, kind of a big year. We'll explain why. Well, we had two ferry routes connecting Nanaimo to Vancouver. We had Canadian Pacific, primarily the Princess of Vancouver, plus a few other ships, and we had Ball Ferries, two ships on the route. At that time, I'm not sure what connected, Canadian Pacific had routes connecting Victoria to the mainland, but I'm not sure how many vehicles they took, and certainly it would have been a longer trip. If it took Canadian Pacific 3.5 roughly hours or 2 3/4 hours to get from Nanaimo to downtown Vancouver, to get to Victoria Harbor would have been way longer. Blackball Transport from Victoria to Port Angeles was another ferry link. This is all just setting up the fact that the island is about to get a little bit isolated. But let's take a look at our ferry schedule. Schedules are fun. The fares in 1961 on Blackball on the Nanaimo route, if you had an automobile, $5 one way. Hey, if you return, you pay just twice that, $10. For a driver or passenger, $2 one way, and if you bought a return trip, you get a small discount. But there you go, $5 for a car, $2 for a person on Blackball between Departure Bay and Horseshoe Bay. Let's compare these two services, Blackball and CP. CP, more luxurious, for sure. More comfortable. Blackball, more utilitarian. That's a good name for it, although still modern and comfortable. Blackball, more capacity. Why? More sailings each day because of shorter trips. CP, though, downtown to downtown service. Blackball, though, on the outside of town, and in the case of Vancouver, on the way outside of town. CP offered reservations. Blackball, you just lined up and waited. So 1958 arrives, and both of these companies have employees with expired collective agreements. And by May 1958, the Canadian Pacific employees on the BC Coast Steamship Service strike. They had a strike starting in May 1958. Fast forward a couple months. Okay, so now we're down to one ferry company connecting Vancouver Island and the mainland as Blackball out of Nanaimo. Fast forward to July, Blackball employees, who are also without a collective agreement, threatened to strike. Guess what? That kind of got the BC government's attention. And it got their attention in a big way, and they did two things, short-term and long-term. Now this short-term, I've tried my best to research it. I've seen it referred to in a couple history books, and so I'll paraphrase this by saying, I might be getting the terminology wrong, but this is in essence what the history books say happened, is that short-term reaction. They tried to take over Blackball, the government did, by invoking a Civil Defense Act or something like that under a state of emergency, and tried placing Blackball under provincial trusteeship to keep it operating in this emergency situation. The emergency being that if Blackball employees struck, then there'd be no ship service between Vancouver Island and the mainland, at least from Nanaimo. Long term, they also on July 17th, in the middle of all this, announced their intention to create their own government ferry system, which eventually, of course, would be known as BC Ferries. You may have heard of them. But back to the short term, and of course they weren't going to create the ferry system right away. It took a couple years. But in the short term, Blackball defied this, and guess what? They still struck on July 18th. I like history when history gets broken down, not by year, not by month, but by day in this fast-moving drama of July 1958. So on July 17th, the government announces its intent to create their own system. On the 18th, Blackball says, guess what? We're still going to strike. They did. The government gets a court order. The strike ends a week later on July 23rd. So Blackball's back. And Canadian Pacific's strike ended up ending later on in July 1958 as well. So by the end of that crazy month of July 1958, both Canadian Pacific and Blackball are back at work. They both continue work on that route. CP, of course, until 1981, and Blackball until late 1961. Oh, that's the end of our talk for 1961. Why was that? Well, BC Ferries, we just alluded to, is what Premier W.A.C. Bennett decided to create on that July day in 1958. 2 years later, their first route was Tawasin Swartz Bay, again, way out from the city on both sides. Two purpose-built ships for BC Ferries at that time. And then a couple years later, just right at the end of 1961, BC Ferries negotiated to purchase the Blackball routes, the Blackball ships, the Blackball terminals. They bought out Blackball in late 61. So the result for Nanaimo was what used to be Blackball's route from Departure Bay now became a BC Ferries route. Along with the two ships on that route, the Chinook and the Kahloke, people like me who like photographs and pretty things like that note that then eventually the ships were repainted into pastel blue, the BC Ferries' lovely color at the time. Apparently Captain Peabody was more happy with this negotiated buyout this time in 61 because he was ready to be bought out and to retire. 10 years earlier in Washington, he felt he still had work to do. So now we're in the era of BC Ferries. It's 1961, the end of 61. BC Ferries is taking over at Departure Bay. Canadian Pacific's still going to kick around on their service for another 20 years, but BC Ferries is about to enter what my friend Jim has called the most ambitious shipbuilding period in BC history, we think, and start to build its service, which impacted Nanaimo. And that takes us to next time I speak, which will be likely sometime next year. We're talking about the BC Ferries era in Nanaimo, and a lot happened during that. So that's where I say thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Sorry, I had to say that.
Thank you for a little. Anyway, on
Google
behalf,
that, you'll hear it.
I'd like to thank you on behalf of the meeting and the society, particularly how you've emphasized Nanaimo and also brought some of the missing history in terms of the Blackball Ferry to light.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, and I hope
Thanks,
you come
Gordon.
back.
Thanks very much. Thanks. Next time I'm here, we can all deck out in pastel blue colored clothing and then